In this lecture, we'll be looking at another early theory of psychology, the Jungian analytic approach, and its primary features. And then we'll look at how it has been applied to interpret fairy tales with an example derived from the preeminent Jung scholar on fairy tales, Maria Louise von Franz, as she applies Jung's insights into the interpretation of tales like The Tale of the Three Feathers. One of the very first experiences a young Carl Jung remembered was sitting upon a stone and experiencing a sense of dissolution. He asked himself, am I the one sitting on the stone, or am I the stone upon which he is sitting? What could this mean? For Jung, he believed that he shared something in common with the stone, something eternal, ancient, and dark that he couldn't quite put his finger on. But nevertheless, this drew his attention and occupied his thoughts. There's something eternal in him, something like the stone. And the second experience then comes from a split he had with the church. He had reoccurring dreams of unmentionable sins and didn't understand why he would be tempted so. He had a dream of being led down into the earth where he discovered a fleshy tree trunk-like object, where he was scolded by his mother, beware the man-eater. Another night, he had a dream of God, who looked like an old man standing above a box-like cloud. Then excrement fell from the sky and crashed down through the church steeple below. And he thought that God was showing him a different side of the eternal and of himself, that there was both light and the dark. Human life could be pleasurable, ordered, and beautiful, but also muddy, visceral, and disgusting. And he considered this to be a divine insight. As a student of psychology, he studied dementia praecox, schizophrenia, under Sigmund Freud. Jung recognized a pattern among the delusions of the patients he analyzed and interpreted this to be an underlying symbolic psychological content that connected himself with them, and something also that was fundamentally human. Jung was relying upon earlier work he had done with Buehler on word association, and it goes a little like this. You would say the first thing that you think of when you hear the following: red, romance, enemy, light, chill, create, curious. What Jung found was then that the test is designed to seek a single answer, but in those questions that mattered to the individual, one specific answer wouldn't suffice, and they were unable to contain the chain of association in their language. And Jung noted that the language of the schizophrenic often revolved around certain images, and these images were shared among many of the patients, which led him to believe that these images comprised something fundamental, normally hidden, about the human experience, and they represented a collective fund of archaic symbols of fantasy content. Jung thought that the images connected them to something beyond themselves, perhaps to something divine, something that was shared by all humanity. And he interpreted this symbolic foundation to affirm his belief that humanity is not isolated, but connected at a fundamental psychological level. From this, he postulated that there could be a collective unconscious, inherited memories that are comprised of instincts and archetypes. These archetypes are symbolic impulses from our earliest concepts, like mother-child, father-child relationships. And also instincts regulate our actions, and then archetypes regulate our perceptions. So these archetypes are viewed as a swampy mess of the unconscious, an ordered side of our psyche made up of connections like neural networks, where meaning is derived from the differences in the symbols in relationship to one another. The archetype, a fundamental role, idea, or relationship, is a dimension of our psyche like a primordial idea that then forms into a social historical context, specific archetypal image which populates the unconscious. Jung's theories combined aspects of Eastern philosophy with science, producing and supporting inherent contradictions in our reality, much like Niels Bohr's innovative thought in quantum theory, in which Jung wrote about later in his life. For example, an archetypal image could be the wise spirit derived from the primordial relationship of a mentor, and then this is formed culturally as Merlin in the European social and historical context of the medieval period. Jung's concepts were used in an experimental therapy that comprised of telling and interpreting stories derived from the focus on dreams that Freud had examined and looking for the underlying structures, like the archetypal images that were involved. For example, if someone had a snake in their dream, he would look for another story, like a tale from ancient Egypt that had a snake for insight. Something like the story of the sun god Ra, who was then threatened to be devoured every night by the serpent Apep. The purpose of this therapy was to connect the individual with a sense of the divine, to connect them to something larger than themselves, and to help them break free from their sense of isolation. For Jung, the function of myth, story, and fairy tale were to help to us access and form meaning, to better understand the world by working directly with the archetypal images brought forth where fantasy and play were expected and acceptable. So how do these stories and archetypal images play a role in therapy? Well, is there a way in which the unconscious part of ourselves can become more conscious? So we go back to his early days, we can see the emphasis on active imagination as a therapeutic tool, the process of associating images, drawing things out of the unconscious, until a person arrives at the center of the personal context of their dream. Think about a dream you had. Are there archetypal elements to them? Are there mythic elements to them? By working these fantasies, as well as delusions and desires and dreams, Jung attempts to guide the person towards their own personal insight and meaning. The emphasis is that the person must make the connections, albeit they are provided the narratives that may fit their construction of meaning. The therapist becomes actively engaged as playing a role. As he continues to do this, he starts to notice certain structures of the psyche, of the personality that provide two basic attitudes. And while these are binary in their relationship to each other, they make the polar ends of a sliding scale in which one dominates, but a person may always vacillate. These two attitudes he called introvert and extrovert, and were defined in the way in which psychic energy flowed, which was the energy gained by turning inward or outward towards the world. So ask yourself which of these you consider yourself to be, in which such situations, and does it fluctuate? To further define the psyche or personality, Jung proposes four functions, also with binary pairs forming the polar ends of one axis and another pairing forming the other, forming the shape of a cross. Jung's Christian background influencing his choice of shape. So he sets thinking and feeling at two ends, and intuition and sensation on the other. And these can also be viewed as abstract and theoretical knowledge with practical and physical experience. Jung thinks that one of these will become dominant, or the superior function, while its opposite will be repressed and form part of the unconscious. The other two will become auxiliary pairs that support the superior function, and this tells the analyst the preferred way of interacting with the world and others. So Jung borrows the idea of the return of the repressed from Freud to help explain how neurotic symptoms and eventual formation of some mental illnesses or personality disorders is produced by pushing down or repressing a particular function. To alleviate symptoms, he posits that there is a necessity to foster the development of the neglected function, which includes heightening awareness of the four functions and working to achieve a well-rounded personality. If you had to decide for yourself, what do you think would your superior function be? As Jung further characterized the psyche quite a bit differently and more complex than Freud's, he combines the attitudes with functions to come upon basic personality types that are reflected in the archetypal images that emerge from the archetypes of the mind. These observations form the basis of the first personality tests, ones that you have most likely experienced taking in any form of personal development class or seminar, also useful in helping you figure out career and professional goals. Jung also makes some predictions on marriage partners according to personality types. So according to Jung, people often seek differing types, usually someone who has the repressed function as their dominant aspect, so that they complement each other's inferior function. If people are of the same type, then this doubling of the superior function can lead to difficulty and a lack of development, balance, and awareness. So there are also four archetypal figures that make up the psyche, and this appears to be more directly influenced and adapted from Freud. He incorporates the death drive into the psyche by casting ego and shadow as the binary relation from which we derive our sense of self. The ego is a light of consciousness that is guarded and cultivated and provides us a sense of purpose and identity. It balances the conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. The shadow, however, is what the ego wants to hide from others, mostly primitive and unadopted, but it can revitalize life if it's tapped into. So the ego is not the self, which is the process of reaching a whole personality. incorporating and acknowledging, integrating ego and shadow together. If the ego, the negotiator, striver, the mask, is confused with the self, the entire being, then the ego can become inflated and destructive. So the self is the psychic entirety, which includes all functions in both attitudes. So if you think about the more you accuse others of doing something wrong, this projection, the more you become a problem unto yourself, because you're not recognizing how that shadow aspect of yourself. If you learn to deal with your shadow, however, then you'll be able to do something for the world, according to Jung. There's also a collective societal shadow and ego, not just individual self, but national identities and groups form these as well, so that there can be clashes between a dominant mode of being and those who are repressed, pitting personality type against personality type on a national scale. So these societal defined aspects of the psyche are the personae and the soul image. The personae is the role we play for society. There is also danger here too in thinking that this is all we are, that we are constructed by the expectations of others and the role we perform. And this is based in part on societal factors as well as our superior function. Identifying too much with the persona, the soul image is supposedly collective and ageless, something we inherit and has to do with what we desire in a partner. And these images are then modified through experience to provide an image of the idealized or not idealized other sex.